In the summer of 1895, Cornelius Vanderbilt II opened a 70-room Italian palace on the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, and called it a cottage. It had cost more than $7 million, required a household staff of dozens, and was the largest of a dozen such houses raised in a single small resort town by the families who defined the Gilded Age: Vanderbilt, Astor, Belmont, Ulrichs. But the grandest of them, a 50-room monument sheathed in a reported 500,000 cubic feet of imported marble, had not been built for pleasure. It had been built as a weapon by a woman named Alva Vanderbilt to force open the doors of a society that had shut her out, and, a few years later, to convert her own daughter into a duchess. The marble still stands on Bellevue Avenue. This is the story of what it was for. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. Many of you watching have walked through these rooms yourselves, over the marble of the Great Hall at the breakers, out along the cliff walk above the sea. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, and what you already knew of the Vanderbilts before this. Then we will go in. The word they used was cottage, and it was the era's own small joke. A cottage, in the ordinary sense, is a modest thing. The houses that lined Bellevue Avenue in Newport at the close of the 19th century were among the largest private residences ever raised on the American continent, and their owners called them cottages the way a man with 10,000 acres might call his, holding a garden. The breakers had 70 rooms. Marble House, a short carriage ride away, had 50, and had swallowed enough imported stone to build a public monument. These were summer houses, occupied for perhaps 6 or 8 weeks a year, kept the rest of the time by skeleton staffs who polished the silver and warmed the marble against the salt air. To walk the length of Bellevue Avenue in those years was to read a ledger. Each house was an entry, a statement of exactly where a family stood in a hierarchy that held no charter and conferred no title, yet was policed as strictly as any court in Europe. The size of a ballroom was a claim. The pedigree of an architect was a claim. The number of servants a family could put in livery, the acreage of lawn it could afford to keep between its marble and the public road, every one of these was a move in a long and nearly silent war over a single question that all the money in America could not by itself answer. The question was which of the great new fortunes would be permitted to call itself an aristocracy. The names along that avenue were the names that ran the country. Vanderbilt money came from railroads and steamships. Astor money came from Manhattan real estate, and before that, from furs. There were Belmonts and Ulrichs and Berwins and Golets, bankers, coal operators, financiers, the industrial families whose fortunes had swelled in the decades after the Civil War, until a handful of American households commanded wealth that the sovereigns of Europe openly envied. They had raised palaces on Fifth Avenue in New York and palaces on the cliffs of Newport, and they had done it, in large part, to be seen doing it by one another. At the center of the contest stood 2 women. One was Caroline Astor, who had governed New York society for a generation and decided, through a quiet machinery of invitations and calling cards, who stood inside its walls and who did not. The other was Alva Vanderbilt, who had married into the largest fortune in America only to discover that it was not enough, that the doors she wanted opened were held shut by a woman who judged the Vanderbilt millions too new to be clean. Between them, and largely because of them, would rise the most extravagant houses the country had ever seen, and caught between them would be a third woman, Alva's only daughter, whose life the houses were built, in part, to spend. In the library of the breakers, set into a mantelpiece carried over from a 16th-century French chateau, there is a carved inscription, In English, it reads, "I laugh at great wealth and never miss it. Nothing but wisdom matters in the end." It had been installed by a family that spent more than $7 million on a house it would occupy a few weeks each summer. Whether anyone who commissioned it lingered over the words is not recorded. This is the story of that world, how the money was made, how it was spent, what it bought and what it cost, and what finally became of the marble. It begins not on the Newport cliffs, but with the man who built the fortune, and with the stain that clung to it no matter how large it grew. The fortune began with a man who could barely write. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on Staten Island in 1794, into a Dutch farming family of no distinction, and he left school as a boy to work the boats in New York Harbor. He was hard, profane, and without visible sentiment. By the time he was finished, he had built the largest steamship operation in America. The title Commodore was a waterman's nickname that stuck to him for life. And then, sensing where the century was turning, he moved from water to iron and assembled the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad into a system that carried the traffic of a continent. When he died in 1877, at the age of 82, he left an estate valued at roughly $100 million. It was the largest fortune any American had ever gathered, and his railroads employed more people than any other business in the country. He had built it by methods that left him few admirers and no illusions about the law. "I, for one, will never go to a court of law when I have the power in my own hands to see myself right," he once said, and he meant it. He gave almost nothing away. He lived, for a man of his means, plainly, and he left the building of palaces to the generations that came after him. The will concentrated the money rather than dividing it. The Commodore left the overwhelming share, some $95 million, to a single son, William Henry, and comparatively little to his 8 daughters or to the son he considered a wastrel, who contested the will for more than a year and then, in 1882, took his own life. It was a dynastic decision in the European manner: keep the fortune whole and keep it under one hand. William Henry proved his father wrong about him. The Commodore had called his eldest son a blockhead and a blatherskite and doubted he could run the business at all. Instead, in fewer than 9 years, William Henry very nearly doubled the inheritance to almost $200 million, which at his death in 1885 made him the richest man in the world. He is remembered now chiefly for 4 words spoken to a reporter who asked whether he ran his express trains for the good of the public. "The public be damned," he answered. The phrase went around the country like a cannon shot. And it fixed the family name, in the public mind, to a particular kind of arrogance, the arrogance of men who owned the roads a nation depended on and answered to no one for how they used them. And here was the paradox that would drive everything that followed. The Vanderbilts had more money than anyone in America, and it bought them almost nothing they most wanted. The doors of old New York society were closed to them, and closed hard. That society was governed by families who called themselves the Knickerbockers, descendants of the original Dutch and English settlers, who regarded a railroad fortune, however enormous, as vulgar and unclean. The rule was unwritten but iron. A fortune needed 2 generations, and preferably more, before its origins could be forgiven. The Astors themselves had begun in the fur trade, which was no more genteel than steamships. But the Astor money was old enough now to have been laundered by time, and the woman who guarded the gate had no intention of opening it for newcomers. That woman was Caroline Astor. Through a social lieutenant named Ward McAllister, she had drawn up a list of the people who truly mattered, the 400, a number said to be the capacity of her ballroom, and the Vanderbilts were not on it. When the old families closed the private boxes of the Academy of Music to the new fortunes, men like William Henry Vanderbilt would eventually build an opera house of their own rather than beg for a seat. But that was a skirmish. The war over the doors themselves would be won by someone the Commodore had never met, someone who carried not a drop of Vanderbilt blood, a young woman from Alabama who had married into the family and decided that she would not wait 2 generations for anything. The young woman was named Alva Erskine Smith, and she had been born in 1853 in Mobile, Alabama, into a prosperous cotton family that the Civil War had all but ruined. Her father was a commission merchant. Her early childhood was comfortable, Southern and secure, and then the war pulled the ground out from under it. The family drifted north to New York, and for a time to Europe, where Alva was sent to a boarding school outside Paris and acquired the 2 things that would define the rest of her life: a love of French chateaux and an iron sense of her own worth. She was, by her family's own account, an impossible child, headstrong, combative, incapable of accepting a closed door as final. The collapse of the family's fortunes seems only to have hardened her. A girl who had known comfort and then watched it vanish learns early that a place in the world is not permanent, and that it can be taken or taken back by those with the nerve to reach for it. In 1875, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, a grandson of the Commodore, introduced to him by her closest friend. It was, on paper, a triumph. She had married into the largest fortune in America. What she discovered was that the fortune came with a wall around it, that the Vanderbilt name, for all its millions, was still spoken in the drawing rooms of old New York as the name of stablemen and steamboat operators. Alva had not married money in order to be kept waiting in an antechamber. She resolved to break the wall, and she chose an unusual weapon with which to do it. She would not flatter or lobby her way in. She would build her way in. Her instrument was an architect named Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt had been the first American admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, had worked on additions to the Louvre, and had come home to become the most accomplished designer in the country. In Alva he found a client of boundless ambition and, unusually for the age, a real architectural eye. A contemporary said of her that she loved nothing better than to be knee-deep in mortar, and it was true. She involved herself in every decision, from the floor plan to the last carved detail, with a seriousness few clients of any kind brought to the work. Together, Alva and Hunt set out to do something that had not been done on Fifth Avenue: to raise, among the sober brownstones of Manhattan, a French Renaissance chateau. They built it at 660 Fifth Avenue, and they labored over it from the late 1870s to its completion in 1882. It was modeled on the great houses of the Loire, turrets, dormers, carved gray stone, a stone hall 60 feet long, and it was unlike anything its neighbors had ever seen. New York called it the Petit Chateau, the little castle, though there was nothing little about it. It sent, in the phrase of the day, a shock through society. It raised the standard by which every new mansion in the city would afterward be judged, and it announced in limestone, visible from the street, that the Vanderbilts intended to be treated not as merchants, but as princes. And yet, a house, however astonishing, is only a house. It can be admired from the sidewalk by people who will still decline to enter it. A palace could stand finished and gleaming on Fifth Avenue while its mistress remained, socially, exactly where she had begun, outside. Alva understood this precisely. To force the doors, she would need more than a building. She would need an occasion, a single evening so lavish, so universally desired, that to be shut out of it would be unbearable, and to shut her out of anything afterward would be impossible. She had such an evening in mind. It would open the petit chateau to the world, and it would be aimed with great care at one woman in particular. The evening was the 26th of March, 1883. The ball Alva Vanderbilt gave to open the petit chateau was, by design, the most extravagant entertainment New York had ever witnessed. Some 1,200 guests were invited. The New York World reckoned the cost at more than $250,000, a staggering figure for a single night, and later accounts would put it higher still. The house blazed with flowers and candlelight, and the guests came in elaborate costume, as mandarins and courtiers and figures out of history. Alva received them dressed as a Venetian noblewoman, a rope of pearls said once to have belonged to Catherine the Great, wound about her waist. The spectacle was real, but it was not the point. The point was a quiet piece of social machinery Alva had set in motion weeks before. Word had gone out that the ball would be the event of the season, and all of society wanted in, the Astors most of all. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, had been rehearsing for weeks with a group of young friends. A quadrille they were to dance at the ball. And then, at the last possible moment, Alva let it be understood that Miss Astor could not be invited. The reason she gave was a masterpiece of etiquette turned into a blade. Mrs. Astor had never once called upon Mrs. Vanderbilt, and one does not, of course, send invitations to the daughters of strangers. It was checkmate, and Caroline Astor knew it. To let the slight stand meant her own daughter would be humiliated, shut out of the party the whole city was discussing. To lift it meant surrender, the formal recognition of the Vanderbilts she had withheld for years. She chose surrender. Mrs. Astor sent her footman down Fifth Avenue to leave her calling card at the Petit Chateau, and with that small rectangle of engraved paper, the wall came down. An invitation came back almost at once. Mrs. Astor attended the ball, and she was observed in long and animated conversation with the woman she had refused for so many years. Afterward, she is said to have delivered the verdict that ended the old order in a single breath. We have no right to exclude those whom the growth of this great country has brought forward, provided they are not vulgar in speech and appearance. The time has come for the Vanderbilts. They were in. It had taken a French chateau and one-night spectacle to accomplish what the largest fortune in America had failed to buy outright, and the lesson was not lost on the woman who had engineered it. Money by itself could be refused. Money made visible, money turned into marble and candlelight, and an occasion no one could bear to miss, could not. Alva had discovered the weapon that would occupy the rest of her building life, and she would use it again on a far greater scale. The ball had a second act that few noticed at the time, but that would matter enormously later. Among the guests was Alva's own sister-in-law, Alice, the wife of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the elder branch of the family, the branch that held the greater share of the fortune. Alice came dressed as the electric light, a costume celebrating the newest marvel of the age, and the newspapers could speak of little else. In the photographs of that night, the two women stand as what they were, rivals inside a single family, each married to a Vanderbilt brother, each about to spend a portion of one of the largest fortunes on earth in the effort to outdo the other. The contest between Alva and Alice, between the younger brother's house and the elder's, would not remain in Manhattan. It would move within a few short years, to a cliff in Rhode Island, and there it would raise the two most extravagant houses the country had ever seen. The same campaign was being waged, meanwhile, on another front. That same year, shut out of the private boxes of the old Academy of Music, the Vanderbilts and families like them opened an opera house of their own, the Metropolitan Opera, rather than ask the old guard for a seat. The pattern was set. When a door was closed, the new fortunes did not knock. They built a larger door, and the grandest doors of all were about to be built not in New York, but by the sea, in a summer colony that was quietly becoming the true capital of Gilded Age America. Newport sits on an island at the mouth of Narragansett Bay, some 180 miles by rail from New York. It had been one of colonial America's busiest seaports, and then, after the Revolution and the rise of larger harbors, it had fallen quiet for the better part of a century. In the middle years of the 19th century, it was rediscovered, first by writers and artists and old Boston families who came for the sea air and built modest wooden cottages along the shore. That older, gentler Newport still lived in memory when the very rich arrived and began, methodically, to erase it. The turn had come in 1852, when a China trade merchant named William Shepherd Wetmore built Chateau-sur-Mer, a great stone villa that Hunt would later remodel and that stood for 40 years as the most palatial house in Newport. But Chateau-sur-Mer would be dwarfed within a single decade. Beginning in the late 1880s, the industrial fortunes of New York and Philadelphia descended on Bellevue Avenue and transformed a relaxed colony of shingled houses into a corridor of European palaces in stone. The wooden cottage gave way to the marble one, and along the seaward edge of it all ran the cliff walk, a public path above the rocks from which anyone at all could look up at the lawns of people they would never be permitted to meet. What drew these families to spend fortunes on houses they would occupy for a matter of weeks was not the sea. It was one another. Newport was where the social order of an entire class was settled each year, in a compressed and merciless campaign, and the machinery of that campaign is worth pausing over. The season lasted about 8 weeks, rarely more than 10, from early July to the first days of September. Within that narrow window, the mistress of a Bellevue Avenue cottage was expected to give no fewer than 6 dinners for 60 guests and 2 balls for 600. A single great house ran on a staff of 3 or 4 dozen maids and footmen, chefs and coachmen, gardeners and laundresses. At the breakers, servants fed the coal boilers in shifts around the clock to generate the house's own electricity. A lady of the season might change her costume 4 or 5 times between morning and midnight, one dress for the beach, another for calls, another for the carriage drive, another again for dinner. When the season closed, the gowns worn that year were given away, never to be worn again, and the next July the whole campaign began afresh. The leading hostesses spent, by common report, millions of their husbands' fortunes each summer, and a man not rich enough to keep the pace could be ruined by the mere effort to try. This was not a retreat from the social war of New York. It was that war at its most concentrated. In the city, society was spread across a great many streets, and a family could avoid the people it disliked. In Newport, everyone of consequence was packed into a single small town for 2 months, within sight of one another's lawns and carriages and guest lists, and there was nowhere to conceal a slight or absorb a snub. The scrutiny was total, and the effort to hold a place within it was relentless and, in its way, joyless. Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, one of the sharpest of the Newport hostesses, was said to greet her returning guests each summer with a line that caught the whole exhausting round in a breath. Here you are again, older faces and younger clothes. Into this arena, in the very years when the season was at its most ferocious, the two Vanderbilt wives came to build. They did not come to rest. They came to win. And Alva struck first, a short carriage ride down Bellevue Avenue from Mrs. Astor's own cottage, on a stretch of cliff where she would raise a house sheathed in enough marble to bury the argument for good. Alva began Marble House in 1888 and finished it in 1892, and she built it to end an argument. It stands at 596 Bellevue Avenue, a short way along the same street from Beechwood, the comparatively modest cottage where Mrs. Astor held court each summer. Alva and Hunt took their model from the Petit Trianon at Versailles, the small palace Louis XV had built within the grounds of the Great One, and they raised in Newport a white temple of a house, a columned portico that has been likened to the front of the White House, a facade of gleaming stone, 50 rooms ranged behind it. Alva called it her temple to the arts. It was also, unmistakably, a fortress, and the thing it was built to defend was the Vanderbilts' place at the summit of American society, which she meant to make permanent and beyond challenge. The figures still astonish. Marble House rose over 4 years at a cost of $11 million, close to $400 million in today's money, of which, by the contemporary accounts, $7 million went to the marble alone. That was 500,000 cubic feet of it, quarried in Italy and in Africa, shipped across the Atlantic, and set in place by stonecutters brought over from Europe for the purpose. The stair hall was built of yellow sienna marble, the dining room of rose-colored Numidian marble from Algeria, cut and book-matched so that the veins in the stone mirrored one another across the walls. The 2 front doors, in the French Baroque manner, weighed 1.5 tons apiece. Every wall of the grand salon was covered in 22-carat gold leaf, until the room was called simply the Gold Room. The gilt bronze chairs in the dining room weighed some 75 pounds each, so heavy that no guest could draw one out unaided, and a footman had to stand behind every seat to move it. 50 rooms were kept by a household staff of 36, and the whole of it, marble and gold and footmen and all, William Kissam Vanderbilt handed to his wife as a gift on her 39th birthday. Alva superintended every detail, down to the color of the stone. She had refused pure white marble for the interior, she later explained, because it would have been cold. It would have been impossible to have used a pure white marble for the interior without having a mausoleum effect too cold for living comfort and joy, she wrote. A revealing sentence from a woman building what was, in nearly every other respect, a monument. Into the Gothic room she installed a collection of medieval and Renaissance art that she had bought entire, in a single transaction, from a French collector, acquiring a pedigree the only way money could, which was all at once. For all its size, the house was to be occupied a few weeks a year. Everything about it, from the Versailles model to the imported stone to the gold on the walls, was addressed less to comfort than to the eye of the beholder, and the beholder, Alva, had chiefly in mind lived a short carriage ride away. When Marble House opened in 1892, it was without serious rival the most opulent private house in America, and it made the older Newport cottages, Mrs. Astor's Beechwood among them, look like what they now were, the summer houses of a gentler and superseded age. Alva had outbuilt the Queen of Society on the Queen's Own Avenue. The point, in stone, was made, and it did not need to be spoken. And then, in the very year Marble House was completed, chance handed the argument to the other side of the family. The elder brother, Cornelius II, the head of the family, the holder of the larger fortune, had watched his younger brother's wife raise the grandest house in Newport, and he would not have been human had he felt nothing at the sight. Late in 1892, a fire gave him his occasion. His own Newport house, an older wooden place that also bore the name The Breakers, burned to the ground. He would build again on the ashes, and he would build something that made even Marble House appear restrained. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was not his brother. Where William was a sportsman and a spender, Cornelius was the dutiful one, chairman of the New York Central, a serious and religious man who worked himself, in the end, into an early grave. He was the head of the family and the keeper of its largest share of the fortune, and he had summered at Newport since 1885, when he bought an older wooden house on Ochre Point, a Queen Anne cottage that already carried the name The Breakers, for $450,000. On the 25th of November, 1892, the same year his sister-in-law completed Marble House, that wooden house burned to the ground. Cornelius did not merely rebuild. He commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had raised Marble House for Alva and the Petit Chateau before it, and instructed him to build something that could neither burn nor be surpassed. The result, finished in 2 years, was an Italian Renaissance palazzo modeled on the 16th-century palaces of Genoa and Turin, 70 rooms, 138,000 square feet, 5 stories, 48 bedrooms for family and staff, 27 fireplaces set on 13 acres of cliff above the Atlantic. Some 2,000 workmen labored on it in shifts, by day and by night, to bring it in on schedule. It cost more than $7 million, and every choice in its construction remembered the fire. There was no wood in its structure at all. It was built of limestone, brick, and steel. The boilers that heated it were buried in a vault beneath the front lawn, well away from the house, so that if they ever failed, they would not take the palace with them. For all its grandeur, the house was built to be run invisibly. Of its 70 rooms, fully a third were given to the servants who made the machinery work, some 40 of them at the height of the season, housed on an upper floor and moving through back stairs and hidden passages so that the family and its guests need never see the labor that warmed the rooms and carried the meals. The palace was designed to look as though it ran itself. Inside, the scale was difficult to take in. The great hall rose 50 feet, a stone cube modeled on the open courtyard of a Genoese palace, its ceiling painted to resemble open sky. The dining room ran to 2,400 square feet, ringed by 12 columns of rose alabaster and lit by 2 great chandeliers of baccarat crystal, its gold leaf laid onto the walls with glue rendered from rabbit skin. The table could seat 34. The house ran on its own electricity, still a novelty in a private home, with gas piped in as a backup for when the new current failed. The bathtubs were each carved from a single block of marble, and were so massive and so cold that the taps had to be run and drained several times over before the stone would hold a bath warm. And in one quiet room off the great hall, Cornelius installed a decoration whose true nature would not be understood for more than 100 years. That room was the morning room, which faced east to take the first light off the sea. Its walls held a series of relief panels depicting the Muses, finished in a silvery leaf that never seemed to tarnish. For a century, everyone assumed the leaf was silver. It was only in 2006, when conservators working with the Winterthur Museum in Delaware examined the panels with an X-ray instrument, that they learned the truth. The panels were not silver. They were pure platinum, a metal then, as now, costlier than gold, chosen, it appears, precisely because it would never darken. The family had paneled a sitting room in platinum, and then, so far as the record shows, neglected to mention it to anyone. The breaker's was the finest thing Hunt ever built, and it was the last. He died at Newport in the summer of 1895, while the final touches were still being applied to the house, so that the same hand which had designed the Petit Chateau and marble house, and this, the whole architecture of the family's Civil War, was stilled at the very moment its masterpiece was finished. The breakers opened that summer as the largest and most opulent house in Newport, larger than Marble House, larger than anything the country had yet seen. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had almost no time in which to enjoy it. The following year, in 1896, he suffered a stroke, and he never fully recovered. He died in 1899, having summered in his 70-room palace by the sea for only a handful of seasons. The grandest house in America had belonged to the man who built it for less time than it had taken to build. The two Vanderbilt wives had now raised the two most extravagant houses in the country, a short carriage ride apart. But they were not alone on Bellevue Avenue. They were only the leaders of a whole procession of families, each spending a fortune to outbuild the last, in a contest whose extravagance would tip, at its height, into the frankly absurd. The two Vanderbilt palaces stood at the summit of the Newport colony, but Bellevue Avenue itself was crowded with rivals, and each new fortune that arrived felt bound to answer the last. A short way along, the silver heiress, Teresa Ulrichs, Tessie, daughter of a Comstock lode mining magnate, hired the architect Stanford White to build Rosecliff, a white French pavilion in the shape of an H, finished in 1902 and designed for a single purpose, which was entertaining. Its ballroom, 80 feet by 40, was the largest in Newport. Farther down stood the Elms, built for the Philadelphia coal baron Edward Berwind, and completed in 1901. Berwind had made his fortune in coal, and coal powered and heated the Elms. Yet he had every lump of it carried through a hidden underground tunnel, in and out of the house unseen, so that no guest need ever be reminded that the magic ran on anything so common as fuel. The concealment was the whole point. The avenue was an exercise in illusion, in appearing to live as European princes lived, while a nation of clerks and farmers looked up from the cliff walk below. By the turn of the century, Mrs. Astor's long reign had faded, and Newport society was governed by a triumvirate of women: Alva, queen of the younger set, Tessie Ulrichs at Rosecliff, and Mamie Fish, wife of the railroad man Stuyvesant Fish. Mamie Fish was the least rich of the three, and ruled instead by Wittee, with the help of a social manager named Harry Lair, who arranged her entertainments and sharpened her tongue. To be cut by Mrs. Fish was almost an honor. When Alva once complained that she had heard Mrs. Fish call her a frog, Mrs. Fish is said to have corrected her. "No, not a frog, pet, a toad." The entertainments these women devised became the enduring image of the age's excess. There was a dinner at which the guests of honor were 100 dogs, some in diamond collars, served a meal in 3 courses while their owners looked on, and at which one overfed dachshund is said to have collapsed at the table. There was a party given for a visiting nobleman, Prince del Drago, who proved, when the moment of introduction came, to be a monkey in full evening dress, seated in a place of honor. There were dinners at which the guests were required to speak only in baby talk. And there was Tessie Ulrichs's bal blanc, the white ball, at which every gown was white, every head powdered white, every flower white, white swans set upon a fountain, and the sea beyond the lawn dressed with the white sails of anchored boats, so that the whole visible world for one night was made to match the hostess's design. All of this reached the newspapers, and it reached them during a decade in which much of the country was living through hard economic depression, with breadlines in the cities a few hours' train ride away. The ordinary readers of those newspapers were, on the whole, not amused. To one America, these were the harmless diversions of people who could plainly afford them. To another, they were a provocation, a portrait of a class that had lost any sense of proportion. Here, I want to stop and ask you directly. Set these evenings beside the country they took place in, and tell me where you come down. Was this the innocent play of people spending what was undeniably their own, or was it something harder to forgive? Leave your verdict below, and while you are there, tell me the single most extravagant thing you have ever heard of, whether from that age or from our own. Whatever the verdict, the families of Bellevue Avenue had arrived at a place that would have astonished the Commodore who built their fortune. They had more money than they could readily find ways to spend. Palaces, yachts, diamonds, dinners for dogs, all of it had been bought. And still there remained one thing that no amount of marble in Newport could confer. It was the prize the Vanderbilts had wanted from the very beginning, the thing that had driven Alva to build in the first place, not merely to be received by an American aristocracy, but to become, by blood, part of a real one. And that could be had only in Europe, and paid for in a currency more precious than money. To buy it, Alva would spend her own daughter. The device by which an American fortune could be turned into an aristocratic bloodline had a name in the newspapers of the day. It was called the Dollar Princess, and the arrangement was simple and, on both sides, largely honest about itself. Across the Atlantic were old titled families, dukes, earls, marquises, whose estates had outlived their incomes, who owned great houses they could no longer afford to keep, and ancient names they could no longer afford to maintain. In America were families with more money than history. The exchange followed of itself. An American heiress brought a fortune, a British lord brought a title, and the daughter crossed the ocean to become a ladyship. There were guidebooks that listed the eligible noblemen of Europe by rank and by estimated need. Over the following decades, several hundred American heiresses would make such marriages, carrying a river of American money into the crumbling houses of the European aristocracy. Alva's own dearest friend had done it, marrying into the family of an English duke. Alva intended that her daughter would do it better than anyone. That daughter was Consuelo Vanderbilt, born in 1877, Alva and William's only girl. From the first, Alva raised her less as a child than as an instrument built to a purpose. Consuelo was educated at home, drilled in languages and music and the bearing of courts, prepared in every particular to take her place one day as a great European hostess. To correct her posture, Alva had her wear a steel rod strapped along her spine, fastened at the shoulders and the waist. When Consuelo disobeyed, her mother is said to have struck her with a riding crop. She grew into a tall, grave, strikingly beautiful young woman, known chiefly for her obedience, an obedience that had been, quite literally, built into her frame. The match Alva chose was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a small and reserved young man whose family called him Sonny, after one of his lesser titles rather than his temperament. He had inherited his dukedom in 1892, and with it Blenheim Palace, the vast ancestral seat of his line, the house where his own first cousin, Winston Churchill, had been born, and he had inherited it very nearly bankrupt. The Duke needed money to save Blenheim. Alva needed the Duke's coronet for her daughter. It was a clean transaction between a mother and a young man who, by his own later admission, felt no affection for the bride. The only difficulty was Consuelo herself, who did not want him. She was in love with an American named Winthrop Rutherford and had secretly engaged herself to marry him instead. What followed, Alva conducted like a siege. She forbade the match with Rutherford. When Consuelo would not yield, Alva is reported to have threatened to have the young man shot. She removed her daughter from society and had her confined to her room, with a servant posted outside the door. And when confinement failed, Alva reached for the one weapon her daughter could not withstand. She fell ill, suddenly, gravely, with what was described as a condition of the heart, and let it be understood that Consuelo's defiance was killing her. To a girl raised to obey, it was unanswerable. Faced with a choice between her own happiness and her mother's life, Consuelo surrendered. She agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough. Alva made a swift and complete recovery. The engagement was announced, and Alva fed its details to the newspapers with the same care she had once given the guest list of a ball, the gown, the trousseau, even the fastenings of the bride's undergarments, all reported to a public hungry for the spectacle of an American girl turned into a duchess. By the 1890s, the traffic in titles had grown so heavy that some 350 American heiresses would eventually marry into the British aristocracy, carrying with them, in today's money, something on the order of £1 billion. Consuelo was to be the most brilliant of them all. The wedding was fixed for the 6th of November, 1895, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. It would be among the most watched weddings in American history, and the bride, on the morning of it, would be a prisoner in her own home. On the morning of the 6th of November, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt dressed for her wedding alone. A footman had been stationed at the door of her rooms, and not even her governess was admitted. Years afterward, she wrote of that morning in her memoirs. "I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone," she remembered, and described putting on the fine lace and the white silk like an automaton, and going down, cold and numb, to meet her father and the waiting bridesmaids. She was 18 years old. The ceremony was held at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, before a crowd that filled the pews and choked the street outside. Police were called out to hold back the thousands who had gathered to watch, and the wedding was reported the following day on both sides of the Atlantic. The groom arrived some 20 minutes late, and the bride, when she came at last down the aisle, was seen to be weeping behind her veil. The newspapers, which had reported every particular of the engagement, recorded the tears alongside the gowns. The terms of the exchange had been settled in advance by lawyers, and they were exact. The Duke received a trust containing 50,000 shares of Beech Creek Railway stock, valued at $2.5 million. The trust guaranteed him a minimum return of 4%, $100,000 every year for the rest of his life, and that guarantee was underwritten by the New York Central Railroad itself. On top of the trust, William K. Vanderbilt settled a further $100,000 a year on Consuelo herself, with a covenant that $2.5 million more would pass to her from his estate after his death. The marriage settlement came to some $5 million, on the order of $180 million in today's money, and in the years that followed, Vanderbilt would spend $2.5 million more, still to build the couple a house in London. The Duke's share flowed straight into Blenheim Palace, a house second in England only to the seats of royalty, whose crumbling roofs and emptied rooms and sold-off library were made whole again with Vanderbilt Railroad money. The dowry mended the roofs, replenished the library, and restored the family jewels. In later years, it would pay for the great formal water gardens laid out on the terrace. A large share of the splendor that visitors admire at Blenheim today was bought in the 1890s with the fortune of an American railroad. A great English house was saved. An American girl had paid for it. Whatever hope Consuelo may still have carried did not survive the honeymoon. Somewhere on the voyage that followed the wedding, the Duke informed his bride that he had married her only to save Blenheim, that he was in love with a woman in England, and that he cared for nothing that was not British. It was, at least, the truth. The couple returned to England and to the great cold house her money had restored, and in due course Consuelo performed her dynastic duty, bearing 2 sons, the heir and, as the saying went, the spare, within 3 years. Then the marriage settled into the long and formal unhappiness for which it had been arranged. She found Blenheim cold and its life airless, and within little more than a decade she and the Duke would live apart. Here is a question worth sitting with. 4 people made this marriage: the mother who forced it, the father who signed the settlement, the Duke who named his price, and the daughter who, in the end, agreed to save her mother's life. Tell me whom among them you hold most responsible, and whom, if anyone, you would be willing to forgive. Leave it below before we go on. The transaction was complete. Alva had what she had wanted. Her daughter was a duchess, her grandsons would be English lords, and the Vanderbilt blood now ran, at last, in a line that traced itself to the Middle Ages. But even as she secured it, the ground was shifting beneath Alva's own marriage. In the same year she sold her daughter into a coronet, she was preparing to do a thing that would scandalize society far more than any arranged wedding. She was preparing to divorce her husband and to leave the Vanderbilt name behind her for good. Divorce, in Alva Vanderbilt's world, was very nearly unthinkable. Among the families of the 400 it carried a stigma close to ruin, and it was almost never a woman who sought it. In 1895, in the very season she married her daughter to a duke, Alva sought it anyway. William Kissam Vanderbilt had been unfaithful for years. There had been a mistress in Paris, and there had been others. Alva, rather than endure it in the silence her class expected of her, took the matter to court and named his adultery in the open. The settlement she received was said to exceed $10 million, along with several estates. Marble House she already owned outright. It had been, after all, a birthday present. The audacity of it is easy to underrate now. Alva had spent 15 years forcing her family up through the rules of society, building the chateau, giving the ball, marrying off the Duke. Now she broke one of society's deepest rules, publicly and without apology, and dared the world to shut its doors on her again. It did not. She did not slink off to Europe to wait out the gossip, as a woman in her position was expected to do. She stayed, she kept her houses, and she obliged the society that had once shut her out to receive a divorced woman without a murmur, a second conquest quieter than the first, and, in its way, more remarkable. She had once remarked that she knew of no art, profession, or work for women more taxing on mental resources than being a leader of society, and having mastered that work, she did not intend to be disciplined by it. Within a year, she married again. Her second husband was Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a Newport neighbor, a sportsman, and, as it happened, one of William Vanderbilt's old friends. The Belmonts were a dynasty in their own right. Oliver's father, August Belmont, had been the American agent of the Rothschild banking house, a power in the Democratic Party, and a figure in American diplomacy. The family name still marks the great horse race run each spring at Belmont Park. The marriage brought Alva a second fortune and, by every account, a far happier household. It also brought her a new house, Belcourt, Oliver's Newport cottage, another of Richard Morris Hunt's designs, and she moved into it, shutting up Marble House entirely, save for its laundry, which she had decided was superior to Belcourt's. William Vanderbilt, for his part, drifted into the life of a wealthy sportsman abroad. He raced yachts and, with his son, helped pioneer the new sport of automobile racing. He lived much of his later life in France and died there in 1920. The marriage that had built Marble House was, by then, a long-closed chapter. There was an irony in all of this that was not lost on those who watched. In the very years that Alva was freeing herself from a marriage she had come to despise, her daughter sat trapped in the marriage Alva had built for her. The mother had claimed for herself precisely what she had denied the daughter, the right to choose. Consuelo would separate from her Duke in 1906, and in time the contradiction would follow Alva into a courtroom where she would be asked to answer for what she had done. Alva had reached the summit. She held two great fortunes, a palace and a castle, and a daughter who was a Duchess of England. By the ordinary logic of the Gilded Age, there was nothing left for her to want, and nothing to do but preside. But Alva Belmont was not built to preside. In 1908, Oliver Belmont died, and his death would turn her, in her 6th decade, toward the most surprising chapter of her long life. And beyond her own story, the wider world that had made Newport possible, the armies of servants, the fortunes no government yet taxed, the serene certainty that things would always be so, was quietly beginning to come apart. For a generation, the families of Bellevue Avenue had lived as though the arrangement were permanent, as though there would always be servants to hire cheaply, coal to burn without a thought, and a government that took none of their income and none of their inheritance. In the first 2 decades of the new century, all 3 assumptions failed at once. The change began with the tax. Until 1913, there was no permanent federal income tax in the United States. A great fortune kept, year upon year, essentially everything it earned. In that year, the 16th Amendment made the income tax a fixture of American life. It began modestly, at a top rate of 7%, but the First World War drove it upward with astonishing speed, and by 1918 the highest incomes were taxed at 77%. In 1916, a federal estate tax was added, so that when a fortune passed from one generation to the next, the government now took its share at the grave. The Commodore had built his empire in a country that let him keep what he made. His great-grandchildren would inherit in a country that did not. The war changed something subtler and just as fatal. The great houses had been built for a world of cheap and plentiful servants, and that world did not survive 1914. The young men and women who had filled the servants' halls went to the front or to the factories, wages rose, and the vast domestic staffs a Newport cottage required, the 3 and 4 dozen hands it took to keep a single house running, became first difficult and then impossible to assemble. A palace that needed 40 servants was worth very little when 40 servants could no longer be found. And the sums involved never stopped climbing. The property taxes alone on the breakers, which the family still had to pay, had risen to some $83,000 a year by the mid-1920s, before the staff, the coal, and the endless repairs were counted at all. The houses had been engineered for a labor market and a tax code that both, within 20 years, ceased to exist. The war reached the family directly and cruelly. In 1915, Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt, a son of Cornelius II, and by his father's will, the principal heir to that branch of the fortune, sailed for England aboard the liner Lusitania. The German embassy had published a notice in the American papers warning that passengers on British ships in the war zone traveled at their own risk. Vanderbilt, like most, disregarded it. On the 7th of May, a German submarine put a torpedo into the ship, and she went down off the coast of Ireland in 18 minutes. Alfred Vanderbilt could not swim. Survivors watched him give away his life jacket to a woman carrying an infant and spend his last minutes helping women and children toward the boats. His body was never recovered. He was one of many losses. Cornelius II had died in 1899. His eldest son had died young, of typhoid, while at Yale. Another son, Cornelius III, had been all but disinherited for marrying against his father's wishes. Alfred was lost on the Lusitania, and Reginald drank himself into an early grave in 1925, leaving behind a young daughter named Gloria. The generation that had built the palaces was gone, and the generation that inherited them was smaller, more scattered, and, increasingly, more interested in spending the fortune than in guarding it. Divided among many heirs, taxed on the income and taxed again at the grave, the greatest fortune in American history had passed its peak and begun quietly to EBB. And yet, in the very middle of all this ending, one member of the family was beginning something. Alva, widowed a second time in 1908, past 60 years old, in possession of two fortunes and the most formidable will of her generation, was about to take everything she had learned in the long war for social supremacy and turn it against the very order she had spent her life climbing into. The cause Alva Belmont chose, at an age when most women of her class were content to preside over their grandchildren, was the vote. After Oliver Belmont's death in 1908, she turned the full weight of her will and her fortune toward the enfranchisement of women, and she pursued it with precisely the imperious energy she had once spent on invitations and ballrooms. She did not so much join the movement as attempt to command it. The transformation of Marble House was the emblem of the change. In 1914, she built a Chinese tea house on the cliff behind it, a jewel of a pavilion perched above the cliff walk, and she used it, and the grounds of the great house itself, to hold rallies for women's suffrage. She reopened the palace she had built to exclude, and she opened its gates to the paying public, charging admission for the cause, selling suffrage teacups and pamphlets on the lawns where she had once entertained the 400. The most exclusive house in America became, for a season, a place the public was invited to enter, provided they came in support of the vote. Asked once where a woman might look for help in the struggle, Alva is said to have answered, "Pray to God, she will help you." She was no genteel reformer. She founded and funded the Political Equality Association, wrote for the newspapers, and in 1916 joined Alice Paul in founding the National Woman's Party, the militant wing of the movement. She bankrolled the campaign that sent women to picket the gates of the White House in 1917, the first such protest in the nation's history, and when some of those women were arrested and jailed, it was Alva's money that stood behind them. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and American women won the vote. Alva lived to see it, and in 1921 she became president of the National Woman's Party, a post she held for the rest of her life. There is a symmetry in all of this that is hard to miss. The same iron will that had forced open the doors of society and had forced a daughter into a marriage she did not want was turned in old age toward forcing open the doors of American democracy itself. The weapon Alva had built for exclusion, she repurposed for inclusion, and she made, at last, a kind of reckoning with the worst thing she had done. When Consuelo obtained her freedom from the Duke of Marlborough, a civil divorce, and an annulment from the Catholic Church a few years afterward, Alva testified that she had forced the marriage upon her daughter, taking the blame publicly and under oath in order to help set her free. And freed, Consuelo made a second life that answered the first. Months after the divorce, she married a Frenchman, Jacques Balsan, an aviator who had loved her since she was 17, and the marriage was, by every account, a happy one. When she came at last to write her memoirs, she called them The Glitter and the Gold. The glitter was the coronet and the cold house in England. The gold was the ordinary happiness that came after. She gave much of her long life to hospitals and to the children of the poor, and she made her peace with her mother. In the end, the two women who had fought so bitterly over a single marriage drew close, and Consuelo named a house of her own in Florida, Casa Alva, after the woman who had once locked her in her room. I will leave one question with you here. The woman who had spent a fortune to shut people out spent her old age spending it to bring people in. The mother who forced her daughter's marriage swore, in the end, to the coercion in order to undo it. Tell me whether you read that as a genuine change of heart, or as the same unbending will that had always, one way or another, insisted on getting its way. I would be interested to know how you see her. Alva Erskine, Smith Vanderbilt Belmont, died in Paris in 1933 at the age of 80. Her funeral was held in New York at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, the same church in which, 38 years before, she had married her weeping daughter to a duke. This time the pallbearers were all women, the mourners were suffragists, and the banners that had once been carried past the gates of the White House were carried past her coffin. Whatever else she had been, she ended as something almost no one would have predicted at the height of her reign on Bellevue Avenue. The world she left behind did not end so gracefully. Even as Alva was buried, the great houses that she and her rivals had raised were being emptied, shuttered, and pulled down. The end came first for the houses on Fifth Avenue. Over 3 decades, the Vanderbilts had raised some 10 great mansions along the stretch below Central Park that New Yorkers had taken to calling Vanderbilt Row. Within a single generation, every one of them would be gone. The Grandest fell the hardest. Cornelius II's mansion, at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, had been the largest private house ever built in New York City, a limestone palace that his wife, Alice, had raised in part to dwarf the chateau of her sister-in-law and rival, Alva. It dwarfed it. He had bought and demolished 5 brownstones to make room for it and set some 600 men to work day and night until the house ran the length of the entire block front. And in 1927, a little more than 30 years after it was finished, it was torn down and a department store, Bergdorf Goodman, was raised on the ground where it had stood. A newspaper of the day, taking inventory of the vanished rooms, marveled that they had been built on so vast a scale that a taxi could turn around in the bathrooms. The pieces of the house were scattered across the city. Its wrought iron gates were carried up to Central Park, where they still stand at the Fifth Avenue entrance near 105th Street, and a great carved mantel by the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The palace of what one writer called an American royal family was broken apart and handed piece by piece to the public. Alva's own monuments went the same way. The Triple Palace, built for William Henry Vanderbilt's family in 1882, was demolished, and the Petit Chateau, the house whose costume ball had battered open the doors of society, the house that had made Alva, came down in the 1920s, while Alva herself was still living to read of it. She had outlived the monument that made her. By 1947, the entire row of Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue had been erased, as though the family had never lived there at all. There was a grim arithmetic to the fall. In 1877, the Commodore had died the richest man in the world, holding a fortune said to be larger than the reserves of the United States Treasury. Within 50 years, no Vanderbilt was counted among the wealthiest Americans. The great fortunes of the New Age belonged to Rockefeller, to Carnegie, to Ford. One of the Commodore's own grandsons, Reginald, gambled and drank his inheritance away, and died in debt. And the family's own chronicler, a descendant, would record that when roughly 120 of the Commodore's descendants gathered for their first family reunion in 1973, not a single millionaire could be found among them. The largest fortune the country had ever produced had been spent, taxed, divided, and scattered in 3 generations. The fall reached all the way into the present. The Commodore's best-known living descendant is a television journalist, Anderson Cooper, the son of the designer Gloria Vanderbilt, and the great-great-great-grandson of the man who had once held more money than the United States Treasury. He built his career on his own work, has said plainly that no family fortune was ever waiting for him, and has called inherited wealth a curse. In time, he would write himself the history of how the House of Vanderbilt rose and fell. 6 generations separated the richest man in America from a working reporter who had to make his own way. The Newport cottages, built of sterner stuff and set on land no developer yet coveted, outlasted the Fifth Avenue houses, but they too had become impossible to keep. Alva sold Marble House in 1932, the year before she died, for a small fraction of the $11 million it had cost to build. The breakers passed down within the family, but the sums needed to keep it were by then beyond what any private fortune cared to bear. Across Newport and across the country, other Gilded Age palaces were being pulled down, carved into apartments, or left to burn. The age of the private palace was simply over. The great houses had been built to outlast the dynasties that raised them, and in the cruelest sense they had succeeded. The marble endured while the money, and the world that made it, drained away. And so the palaces of Bellevue Avenue faced the fate of the Fifth Avenue Chateau, to be sold for scrap or pulled down or left to the weather. That most of them were not, that the breakers and Marble House still stand today, open to anyone who buys a ticket, is owed to a rescue that no one on Vanderbilt Row could have foreseen. The rescue came from an institution that did not exist when the houses were built. In 1945, a small group of Newport residents founded the Preservation Society of Newport County, dedicated to saving the town's architecture from the wrecking ball. Its instrument, in the case of the breakers, was the last Vanderbilt to own it. Gladys, the youngest daughter of Cornelius II, and Alice, who had inherited the house and found it, like so many heirs before her, a magnificent burden. In 1948, Gladys did a thing her grandmother's generation would have found unthinkable. She leased the breakers to the Preservation Society for $1 a year and allowed the public, anyone with $1.25 for a ticket, to walk through the ground floor of the house. The proceeds went to preservation. Gladys kept an apartment on the 3rd floor. in what had once been the servants' quarters, and lived quietly above the crowds who came to gape at the rooms below. The most private house in America had begun, cautiously, to open its doors. In 1972, the Society bought the breakers outright, together with most of its original furnishings, for $365,000, less than Cornelius II had paid 87 years earlier for the wooden house that once stood on the site. The family was permitted to keep the third-floor apartment for their lifetimes, and for another 46 years they did, the great-grandchildren of the man who built the palace summering in a few rooms at the top of it, hidden from the hundreds of thousands of strangers who filed through the marble halls below. That arrangement ended in controversy. When the Society proposed to build a modern welcome center on the grounds, a place to sell tickets and provide the amenities that 400,000 annual visitors require, the family opposed it, together with preservationists and neighbors who felt it would spoil the historic setting. The dispute went as far as the state's highest court, and the Society prevailed. The Welcome Center opened in 2018. In that same year, the last Vanderbilt descendants left the third floor for good, the Society citing the failing, century-old systems of the house, the family and its allies suspecting retribution for their opposition. A cousin of the family remarked tartly that the place had been a good deal more interesting when the family still lived in it. In 2024, even that third floor, the family's last redoubt, was opened to the public. There was an irony in it that the Society itself had once seemed to grasp. A former president had written, decades earlier, that it helped the museum to be able to tell visitors that the founders' great-grandchildren continue to live in the house. If you have walked through any of these houses, the Breakers, Marble House, one of the others, I would like to hear what it felt like to stand inside one. And tell me something harder while you are there. Are palaces like these better off belonging to the public, crossed each day by anyone with a ticket, or is something lost when a family's home becomes a museum? I'll read what you leave. Today, the Breakers draws some 400,000 visitors a year, more than any other attraction in Rhode Island, and it is one of 11 historic properties the Preservation Society owns and opens to the public. Marble House stands a mile down Bellevue Avenue, its gates open, its gold room and its great hall crossed each day by ordinary people who have paid to see them. The Elms, Rosecliff, Chateau-sur-Mer, all of them are museums now. In recent years, the cameras of a television series set in the Gilded Age have filled their rooms with actors playing the very families who built them and sent a new generation of visitors up the avenue to see the real thing. And here is the final turn of the story. These houses were conceived as instruments of exclusion, raised to keep the wrong people out, to display a supremacy that ordinary Americans might look upon but never enter. A century later, they belong to the public. The gates that were built to shut people out now admit anyone who buys a ticket. The rooms designed to overawe the uninvited are crossed all summer by the uninvited. The palaces built to divide a country by class have become, of all things, democratic, the shared property of the very public they were made to exclude. Over the library fireplace at the Breakers, carved into the stone and carried across the ocean from an old French chateau, there is an inscription, a boast, in the voice of some long-dead nobleman, that he cared nothing for riches and did not miss them, since in the end only wisdom endures. It is a strange thing to read in that room, in that house, a profession of indifference to wealth set into the most extravagant private dwelling of its age, in a family whose entire claim to greatness was its money. The Vanderbilts, one suspects, did not intend the irony, but the inscription turned out to be truer than they knew, For the houses were built to say one thing, and they ended by saying another. They were meant to be permanent declarations in stone and marble and gold that these families had arrived and would endure, that their names would be spoken with awe for as long as the walls stood. And the walls stood. It was the families that did not. Within 3 generations the fortune was scattered, the names had lost their power, and the palaces passed out of private hands altogether. The marble outlasted the money, exactly as the inscription warned. What the great houses commemorate now is not the permanence of the Vanderbilts, but the impermanence of even the greatest American fortune, the speed with which $100 million, and all the certainty that came with it, could simply drain away. And there is a second irony folded inside the first. These were monuments to exclusion, raised to hold a nation at arm's length. Yet the nation did not tear them down. It took them, and kept them, and opened them, and made of them something their builders never imagined, a shared inheritance, walked each summer by hundreds of thousands of the very people the gates were meant to keep out. The Temple of the 400 became a museum of the many. Alva Vanderbilt spent the first half of her life forcing her way into a closed aristocracy, and the second half prying that aristocracy open. In the end, the houses followed her. They began as the most private places in America. They became some of its most public. That is what the marble was for, though no one who laid it ever knew. Before you go, I'd like to hear from you. Of all the people in this story, Alva with her iron will, Consuelo in her tears, the Commodore who began it all, the strangers who walk the halls today, tell me which one stayed with you and why. I read the comments on these films, and yours may well shape the next one. And if you would care to come with me to the next great American dynasty, the next fortune built high and brought low, the next empire measured in acres, consider subscribing so the story finds you when it is ready. Tell me, too, whose house I ought to walk through next, the family, the fortune, the place you have always wondered about. I keep a list, and it grows from what you leave below. Until then, thank you for spending this time in the marble halls.